This episode is brought to you in part by the Apologetics Guy Show, the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about Christianity. Learn to explain your faith with courage and compassion. Join Moody Bible Institute professor Dr. Mikel Del Rosario at apologeticsguy.com.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. It can stand on its own, but when you're done, go back and start at the beginning of the season with the episode, What is Biblical? This one is going to mention racial violence, but it won't be graphic. Just a heads up. This is George Wallace. Today, one of the most consequential politicians of the 20th century that you've probably never heard of. Alabama Governor George Wallace. The last line of the book, The Politics of Rage by historian Dan T. Carter, describes Wallace like this.
He was the most influential loser in 20th century American politics.
The most influential loser. A man who toured the country, rallied Madison Square Garden, vexed Martin Luther King, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and black people all across the country. He became the symbol of racism in America for a generation of people, only to be, largely, forgotten today. My guest today is Dan Carter himself.
I'm a emeritus professor at the University of South Carolina and a specialist in American race relations, regional history, and 20th century American politics.
Author of several books, including The Politics of Rage, The Origins of the New Conservatism, and The Transformation of American Politics. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Wallace was born in 1919 in Alabama.
He grew up in a community, not much to do. The big downtown population, 1,800, Clio, Alabama, they taught politics, and he became fascinated by it from the time he was 10, 11 years old.
His father was a failed farmer, an alcoholic, and his mother distant. They were poor in a tough time for Alabama. A study showed that in 1924 in Barber County, where Wallace grew up, 85% of all school children had hookworm. Most families never saw a dentist or a doctor. It was racially segregated, with $26 spent on white school students per year and only $4 for black students. By the 1930s, there were no classes for black children beyond the 6th grade, and half got 2 years of schooling or less. It was also a time of peak membership of the KKK.
When he was about 13 or 14, he had a visit to the state capitol in Montgomery, and there's a star where Jefferson Davis swore in as head of the Confederacy in 1861. He stood at that point and said, "Someday I'm going to be governor of Alabama."
Quite the audacious goal for someone like him. He studied, worked as a page in the state legislature, got his law degree, partied, and treated women poorly. Married his wife Lurleen, and when it came to fighting in World War II, he joined with the enlisted men, unlike many of his friends who attended officer training, knowing that when he returned and ran for office, it would make him more of a common man. Voters love a common man. George was an engineer for a B-29.
Every spare minute he had, he was writing postcards to people all over the county where he grew up because he was already thinking about running for some political office.
While he was in active military duty, the man loved to campaign. After the war, he returned to Alabama, where he learned from watching Governor Jim Folsom.
He was almost unique among American Southern politicians of the period. He didn't care anything about race. He wasn't obsessed with race. It wasn't his issue. And he was very much a kind of class politician who believed that blacks and whites, particularly working class, poor whites, shared more than the racial division that separated them. And he was a full-blown liberal for the period. I mean, he didn't challenge segregation in the 1940s and 50s, but unlike other Southern politicians, he actually worked very hard to try to get opportunities for black Alabamans. He worked very hard to give blacks the right to vote in the 1940s and 1950s.
He framed this in terms of Christian duty. White people were to help their black neighbors. end the poll tax, give them access to education, and a decent wage. Not bad for a governor of Alabama. Folsom was also a drunk, a brawler, and skimmed a bit off the top, so he's not really an angel. But Wallace watched this closely. He too was a liberal Democrat, a fan of Franklin Roosevelt, but a segregationist, with some quirks. As a state legislator, Wallace got an appointment to the Board of Trustees of the all-black Tuskegee University, adopting a paternalistic stance on black education.
Folsom was down to earth. He talked in a down to earth way. He blended in with working class folks. Wallace learned that if you're going to be a successful politician, you can't set yourself apart from the voters.
Wallace practiced a little law and then became a circuit court judge. Struggled to support his family. Had his wife walk out on him several times. Alabama was changing from a state with a strong Democratic liberal movement to a conservative one.
After Brown versus Board of Education and the beginnings of resistance to racial segregation, things changed. And Wallace was sort of caught in that period because he had had a back history of moderation, liberalism, even economically. And when he decided to run for governor in 1958, he was caught up in that shift that was taking place. And so when he ran for governor in 1958, his opponent was an out-and-out white supremacist.
Meanwhile, Wallace tried to walk an uncomfortable line.
He was against the Ku Klux Klan. He was in favor of segregation, but he talked about moderation and following the law, treating people fairly. He had been a judge for a period of time, and one of his most common ads was that he, as a judge, had tried to treat all the people in his court, which he did, fairly without regard to race, he said, color or creed. And if that's not what you want in a governor, don't vote for me, because that's who I am. Well, that's not what they wanted. And he lost.
The thing he'd wanted from a young age, to stand on the steps where Jefferson Davis stood and become governor, was his dream. And his quote-unquote moderate efforts failed him.
The night that he lost in 1958, he turned to his friends just before he gave his concession speech and said, John Patterson, who was his opponent, had out, and I use the N word here, out in me, and I'll never be out in again.
He'd never be out N-worded again. He'd make race the issue of his future campaigns. He'd discard the ways of Jim Folsom and go on his own. Sensing that the paternalistic subjugation of black people in the South was making way for violence and protest, he rode that wave to the governor's office. Then became a national figure as he campaigned for president 4 times, shifting the national conversation to open racism. This man, this poor boy from Alabama, would forever shape politics in the United States. By losing time and again, he'd push both parties to appeal to racists and uncover the wickedest parts of our national soul. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce. Wallace was on a mission to change his public image, to make a big splash, get in the papers. His plan? Resist federal orders to integrate schools. Then he could play it off not as racism, but stopping the big bad federal government from involving itself in state politics. During the Eisenhower administration, which was not very aggressive on civil rights, the Justice Department and the Civil Rights Commission started to get more serious.
The most striking one is John Doerr, who was Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. And Doerr and a group of other civil rights activists in the Justice Department began bringing lawsuits. And the lawsuits were to require that local voter commissions of the people who registered the voters had to present a full list of who had voted, who had been allowed to vote, and who had been rejected, because they wanted to show, and it was absolutely true, that blacks were systematically rejected.
This was the opportunity that Wallace had been waiting for. The feds demanded detailed records that belonged to the state, giving Wallace an opportunity to draw attention to himself. He did what he would continue to do throughout his life: set the stage for a big show. He had 2 friendly attorneys bring suit alleging voter fraud. To investigate these charges, voter records, the same ones the Civil Rights Commission needed for their research, would be turned over to the courts, where he would hold them captive. By doing so, he could market himself as the little judge who stood up to the feds.
So that's when Frank Johnson, federal district judge from Alabama, is brought in. He had been a classmate and a friend of Wallace in University of Alabama when they were both in law school.
Now Wallace would face charges and would stand before his friend in court for obstructing the investigation.
Johnson secretly met with him and said, if you don't turn over these voting records, I'm going to put you in jail.
Just the kind of threat Wallace needed to make himself look like the lone man standing for what he thought was right. The cowboy, the brave soul. Something the media just ate up. But what the papers missed was...
It really frightened Wallace.
Because he was worried about being placed in jail with black men who might not take his race baiting so kindly.
And so he worked out a scheme in which he would secretly tell them to give the records and then announce publicly that he was standing up and he wasn't allowing this. It was all a face-saving maneuver, but it showed how, as Judge Johnson said, this cat has 9 lives. He is always ready to turn around a defeat into victory.
Wallace lost the fight. He surrendered the records. But it really didn't matter. There's a reason Dan calls him the most influential loser in the 20th century. What mattered was the spin, the narrative he could create around his stance, upsell the defiance, and downplay the loss. He'd positioned himself as the leading Southerner protecting the segregated status quo, the fighting little judge, and he was a shoo-in for the next governor's race. It was political theater. The fake election suits, seizing the records, and the threat of jail. And Judge Johnson wasn't playing along. But Wallace got the win, even though he lost.
He certainly wasn't the first politician to lie. We've always had that problem, but he was particularly skilled at simply saying something firmly, repeatedly, over and over again that was untrue. And this is during a time when newspapers, they didn't add a sentence at the bottom of it saying this is a lie. The general way of covering was, and I was a newspaper reporter for a couple of years, is you reported what someone said. It seems to me he's certainly not the first, but one of the most successful early politicians of the modern age of media at understanding that lying was not a real disadvantage. If you kept up with it, if you just repeated it over and over and over again, you might not convince everybody, but you'd convince a lot of your followers.
Tell the people that you've stood up for them enough times, and some of them will believe it. Tell them that being pro-segregation has nothing to do with being racist, but of course it does. Repeat that states' rights is a philosophy independent of racism. It's not, but if you say it enough, some of your followers will believe you. Decades later, the judge, Frank Johnson, said this, and this is an actor reading the line.
No matter how high up you threw him, he landed on his feet like a cat. I would detest the way he would go about misleading the people of Alabama for the purpose of his political career.
This trumped-up standoff is the kind of story George Wallace needed to place him in the zeitgeist. He took what he learned losing his first race for governor and spun it into a winning strategy by defending segregation.
He had written his own speeches basically the first time. His second race, he secretly hired a man named Asa Carter, who was a white segregationist of the 50s, who in fact was head of a violent Klan group, so violent that his men had castrated the black man at random. Well, he was, at this point, he was not accepted even in Alabama. But Wallace hired him, and Asa Carter turned out to be a brilliant writer.
Under a pen name, Asa Carter also wrote The Education of Littletree and The Rebel Outlaw Josie Wales.
Some of the best lines, some of the best speeches that Wallace gave during that campaign were written by Asa Carter, this former Klansman. And they were all pithy, hard-hitting, emphasizing over and over and over again that he would resist the integration of Alabama schools. And his phrase was, "I will stand in the schoolhouse door to prevent the federal government from integrating the University of Alabama or any schools in Alabama."
It was Asa Carter who wrote the most famous line of Wallace's career for his inauguration speech.
"Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever."
Wallace was elected for his vitriol around segregation, saying this, and I've bleeped the N-word.
"I started off talking about schools and highways and prisons and taxes, and I couldn't make him listen. Then I began talking about and they stomped the floor."
Wallace was now the governor, taking office in early 1963. But George didn't much like governing. He liked running. Now that he had the prize he dreamed about since childhood, he turned his sights to a bigger chair, President of the United States. Just as he needed a bit of theater to win his state office, he'd need another to go national. The University of Alabama would be his stage. The Kennedy administration had integrated the University of Mississippi in 1962, leading to murders and mob violence on campus. Then there was the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis. They did not want a repeat performance of Mississippi, and could not afford another humiliation. This time, the Kennedys would have federal troops standing close by. Wallace called together the state's education leaders and threatened them.
"If you agree to integrate your schools, there won't be enough state troopers to protect you. I'm not going to ask the Alabama legislature to run an integrated school."
Nick Katzenbach, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, was there. And he was in a difficult situation because he knew that although President Kennedy at the time was very reluctant to bring in troops, but he had made it clear that he would nationalize the Alabama Federal Guard and escort these 2 black students to classes,
presenting Wallace with a dilemma that he could turn into an opportunity. He campaigned promising that if schools were to integrate, he would stand in the schoolhouse door, blocking their way.
He's the one that was the stage manager. He scheduled this for late in the morning, and he confronts Nicholas Katzenbach, representative of the federal government, Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. And they have a standoff in which Katzenbach says he has a court order to bring these 2 students into the classrooms, and Wallace says, "I stand between you and representing the sovereignty of Alabama," and blah, 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 blah.
As the cameras rolled, Wallace had his moment of defiance. Though, at this point, the 2 black students were already registered and had their keys to their dorm rooms. He wasn't actually blocking them from anything. But Wallace needed this moment of theater, and he wanted to be the only person in the way, instructing school representatives not to join him. He even told the KKK not to intervene, which wasn't terribly difficult because 2 of its most prominent members in the region, Asa Carter and Robert Shelton, were on his payroll. This was to be his spotlight, and Wallace was, once again, afraid of being put in jail. One witness said that before the cameras rolled, George was so nervous that he looked like he was on amphetamines. But once the cameras were on him, he was cool as ever.
So that's done earlier in the day. What Wallace realized was, it's hard for today's young people to realize, but there were no video cams on videotape.
There were, but the technology was limited.
Instead, you had to do everything on film. It had to be taken to a film laboratory, had to be developed, and then had to be taken to, in this case it was Tuscaloosa, had to be taken to Birmingham to be transmitted on what were the early cell towers that could transmit video images. So that was in the morning. There's this confrontation he has with Nick Katzenbach. Well, in the afternoon, he gives up. He realizes he doesn't have any choice, so he reluctantly, well, that filming takes place late in the afternoon. Well, what do you have on the nightly news? And I've looked at the old three major networks. In every case, the only visuals they have are of him confronting Katzenbach. And they do say in the voiceover immediately afterwards that later he does capitulate. But he learned what we all know is a picture's worth 1,000 words. And what Americans saw across America was him with his jaw strutted out and kind of rooster style, confronting the federal government.
The cameras caught him standing in the doorway to the school. Once again, George Wallace lost a standoff. The federal government persisted. The students successfully enrolled in the university, but the governor knew how to spin. Television cameras saw him resisting the federal government, and that's all he needed. Now, George Wallace was a national name, and he intended to capitalize on it, not just in Alabama, but by running for president. Civil rights demonstrations increased in the 1960s as African Americans wanted not only lip service with laws passed to protect their voting rights and access to public accommodations, but enforcement of those rights as well. George Wallace, with his eye on the presidency, had to tone down his image. He ran for governor on a purely racist campaign. That wouldn't fly nationally. He couldn't just come out and say racist stuff about these marches and protests. Instead, he needed a scapegoat.
The issue of anti-communism had reached its peak, of course, in the 1950s, but it was still a powerful force in American life. I mean, the John Birch Society was still, they had accused Eisenhower of being a communist, and you still had a very large, ultra-conservative, anti-communist movement all over America. And what Wallace, and he wasn't the only one, but what Wallace was particularly good at doing was linking civil rights to communism. That this whole civil rights movement had been concocted in Moscow, and it was designed to overthrow the government by creating chaos and conflict around race.
Something that was done by conservatives more recently during the Black Lives Matter movement. Like when Mike Gonzalez of the Heritage Foundation published his book, BLM, The Making of a Marxist Revolution. Heritage being the people behind Project 2025. Rather than come out with clear racism, they coded their language and hid behind a communist scapegoat.
Well, that was a much more appealing argument to non-Southerners, and it allowed him to link up his resistance to federal intervention in school segregation to the larger national issue of anti-communism. And when you start looking at his growing national support, and it began growing in the 1960s.
Wallace built up a series of social issues and enemies to blame for them, then peppered that stuff through his speeches. For example, when it came to opposing Abington v. Shemp, which removed mandatory Bible reading from schools, and remember, not all schools were doing it at that time, Wallace responded by saying that the
chief, if not only, beneficiaries of the present court's constitutional rulings have been duly and lawfully convicted criminals, communists, atheists, and clients of the NAACP.
As well as,
we find the court ruling against God.
Do you see it there? He was able to mix social and religious issues together with the fear of communism within his attacks on organizations like the NAACP, not to mention criminals and atheists. The perfect boogeymen for his era. Wallace was on a roll, but soon faced another public event, one that he couldn't spin: the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church.
That was when someone, a group of Klansmen actually, secretly put a bomb next to the black church there in Birmingham, where a good bit of civil rights activity had taken place. Well, when the bomb went off, it killed 4 little girls. And that ignited such revulsion around the country.
It was a truly horrible event, but not an uncommon one. From 1948 to 1965, more than 200 black churches, homes, as well as synagogues were bombed in the Deep South. Not to mention scores of black people who were killed via police shootings or locked in police custody. As shocking as this terrorist act is, it was, unfortunately, not rare.
And it threw him a little bit. He tried several responses. One, that it was actually the communists who may have done this, as to create martyrs. That didn't fly much of anywhere. So he really, that was a moment in '63 that he did have a kind of kickback a great deal. Not only outside the South, but even in the South. There were a number of cartoonists and editorialists who said, this is the consequence of the kind of violent language you're using. But this country has a very short memory cycle. By the time that he decides to run for president, the Democratic nomination in 1964, that was old news.
And the story of the 4 little dead girls faded. All of this publicity left well-meaning people wanting to hear from this man in the South who whipped people into a frenzy, to debate him or understand his ways. But in doing so, they gave him oxygen.
He launched a speaking tour, mainly going to the most liberal universities in the country,
including Harvard, the alma mater of the Kennedy brothers, followed by Smith, Dartmouth, Brown.
I was president of one of them at the University of Wisconsin when I was in graduate school. And there he really refined a kind of speaking style that I don't know of any other politician who's been as good as he was at it. And that is, he deliberately wanted left-wingers, activists, to shout him down, because then he could play the martyr. I'm just trying to present my point of view, never in an explicitly racist way. And here you are, and you claim you believe in the First Amendment, and yet you won't let me speak. That's part of his shtick was. The other part was, heckler with long hair, a young man with long hair, would start shouting at me. He'd say, "Ma'am, if you'll just, you're not a lady, you're a man. Oh, I'm so sorry," he said. And he would try to turn the crowd. And a lot of times people, it's like they couldn't help it. They would start laughing. He was a great political comedian.
Which only made him look funny, or like a martyr. He was charming, clever, but also knew how to get a crowd going. He found big audiences in immigrant communities, some of whom worried that the federal government was going to give their jobs to black people. Wallace launched his bid for the Democratic nomination in the same town where Senator Joseph McCarthy was born. You may remember McCarthy as the same demagogue who accused people of communism in the federal government and military without any evidence, ruining lives in the process. For someone like Wallace, who tied everything back to communism, this was a useful link. Around that time, a coalition of Catholics, Jewish leaders, and Protestants came together in Wisconsin to denounce him. To little effect. But I wanted to mention it here because he's going to get a lot of support from loud Christian voices in the second half of the show. And I want you to remember there were godly people who stood up to him, even if it was to little effect. His subject matter changed depending on where he was.
When he's outside the South, he doesn't even talk about race that much. He talks almost entirely about the repressive nature of the federal government. If he's in an area where you have lots of labor unions, he will talk about the way in which the federal government is trying to destroy your union rights, because often unions at that time, it was dependent on seniority and on connections that you had. And the implicit message was, if they keep on, they're going to make sure that blacks get jobs that you would have had in your union. To people in immigrant communities, in particular close-knit immigrant communities, He talks about the housing efforts of the federal government, the Federal Housing Authority and the Civil Rights Division, to try to require that there be no discrimination against individuals in renting or buying homes. And he talks about preserving your neighborhoods. And again, he doesn't explicitly mention race, but there it is.
He also attacked the Supreme Court, a favorite of ultra-right people like the Birchers, especially as they handed down rulings allowing the distribution of obscene materials. There were so many morality issues to hit on that he didn't really have to talk about race in the North, at least not directly. His eyes were on the presidency.
In 1964, Wallace launched what most people regarded as a quixotic campaign to run in Wisconsin, a very liberal state at the time, and in Indiana, which was more southern, and in Maryland, which is a border state. And the assumption was that he wouldn't get, a very small percentage of the vote. The governor of Wisconsin said he'll get less than 5% of the vote. Well, it didn't work that way.
While he didn't win the Democratic nomination, he startled establishment politicians with just how well he did. In Wisconsin, he captured about a third of the vote in the Democratic primary. In Indiana, 30%. And in Maryland, he won 16 of the 23 counties. In some of them, getting 90% of the votes there. This racist governor of Alabama was pulling real numbers in the North, good enough to give him a coalition he could build on again in 1968, while also activating followers for Barry Goldwater. In 1964, it was incumbent and Democrat Lyndon Johnson against Republican Barry Goldwater. While Wallace didn't get the Democratic nomination, he stirred up a constituency. Democrats who were upset about the size of the government programs created by their party, who were also upset about race. Goldwater appealed to these people who were on their way out of the Democratic Party as Kennedy and Johnson passed more and more civil rights legislation. Wallace wanted to be Goldwater's running mate, but he was rejected. I cannot stress how much the 1964 election changed the face of American politics as the far right and racist entered the mainstream in a way that they hadn't in a long time. When we return, we'll see how Wallace built on this subtle, not subtle racism, how he gained steam, forcing politicians like Richard Nixon to follow his lead. While you listen to the ads, why not take a moment to tell your friends about the Truce podcast? And also subscribe to the show in your podcasting app. It means you'll get every new episode as it's released, and it helps my numbers stay more consistent. Okay, here come the ads. Hey everybody, really quick, I just want to tell you about a new feature on the website. If you want to, say, share episodes with your friends about multi-level marketing, or Season 6, or Season 5, or stories about the American West, you can now go to the website and share collections. All those topics and more are gathered together in their own pages, so it's easy to share with your friends and family. You can find them right there on the homepage at trucepodcast.com. Thanks for sharing the show, posting comments on social media, and please remember to keep Truce in your prayers. Okay, back to the program. Welcome back. Today we're talking about Alabama Governor George Wallace.
Everything changes between 64 and 68. It's not just the Vietnam War, it's the violence, the upsurge of civil disturbances in America's cities across the nation. Suddenly this nonviolent civil rights movement that everybody can be so supportive of in the March on Washington and passage of the Civil Rights Act, now it's much more identified with lawless blacks and ghettos of the North. And the shift in American politics begins to take place, and particularly in the Republican Party.
The protests, demonstrations, social change, and the omnipresence of violence on TV created a new interest in a demagogue like Wallace. Yes, more and more white people saw the violence used to control black people as they were beaten and sprayed with fire hoses. But in August of 1965, they also watched the Watts riot in Los Angeles.
Television by then had totally transformed the way in which Americans saw events. And what they saw, because it was certainly newsworthy, was night after night of burning cities and violent mobs and clashes with the police,
stoking the idea that cities were lawless. New groups sprouted in the South called peace commissions that used dubious methods to tie the Kennedys, Johnson, and the DNC to suspected communists like Union Rep Walter Reuther, civil rights leaders, and the National Council of Churches, throwing literally every boogeyman at the race issue, including the old fundamentalist modernist debate from last season, maybe taking a page from the handbook of the John Birch Society. Then there were the civil rights marches to Montgomery, one ending in violence, the other rather peaceful. Of course, segregationists played up the idea that it was riddled with free love, providing no real proof. As governor, Wallace wielded his power like a true demagogue, revoking government contracts from anyone who didn't follow him completely. But, at least it seemed, he couldn't hold the office forever. Alabama had a rule in place. No governor could serve consecutive terms. This office was his platform. It was the thing that was going to carry him to the White House. He worried that if he lost his position, he'd lose his influence.
Several of his advisors, and notably his secret speechwriter, Asa Carter, said, "Run Lurleen. Everybody loves Lurleen."
Lurleen was George Wallace's wife, a shy woman who put up with his never being home. And for all of his moralizing on the campaign trail, he cheated on her often. And now he needed her to run for his office so he could stay in the spotlight.
She did not want to do it, but she was a loyal wife, and he persuaded her to run for governor.
She was not a gifted politician, but Lurleen had a number of advantages as a candidate.
For one thing, you were still in this time in American history in which it was very difficult to attack women. It was somehow considered ungentlemanly.
Baffling her opponents. How do you counter the Wallace claims when people are going to accuse you of attacking a woman? She took to the stage, read her short, pre-written speech, and yielded the microphone to her husband. Together, they won. But nobody was under the illusion that Lurleen was in charge.
Really, George Wallace was the governor. Everybody knew that. When somebody said, "I need to speak to the governor," and she said, "Well, George is down the hall." And he said, "No, I need to speak to you." And she basically said, "No, George is the governor." And he made all the decisions. He chose all the cabinet people. When individuals got ready to pass legislation in her administration, they went to him rather than to her.
She had battled with cancer before, but during her run for office, it became clear that it had returned. She was forced to fight through the pain, touring the state between treatments. Lurleen Wallace died in 1968, as Georgia's second campaign for president was in full swing, leaving Wallace to choose between being at her bedside and making speeches. He made the speeches. Once again, he stirred the country with his rhetoric as he ran for the presidency.
Wallace, who decides to run as a third-party independent, the American Party independent candidate, jumbles it up again. Because what Richard Nixon, who's running in 68, decides is all he has to do is let the Democrats self-destruct. He'll speak above the fray. He'll be a moderate. He'll be opposed to massive busing or whatever, but he's going to set himself apart from someone like George Wallace. And it doesn't work. He does win, but he very narrowly wins.
The race between Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon was close in the popular vote, with Nixon pulling ahead by just about 1 million votes. Wallace was nowhere close, but he managed to siphon off just enough that he came close to changing the outcome.
And the reason it doesn't work is because several southern states go for Wallace. And moreover, polls show that many of the people who cast those 13% of the vote for George Wallace nationwide, the majority of those would have voted for Nixon. And he would have won very easily in 1968 had it not been for Wallace.
The result is that Nixon, who framed himself as a moderate, turned rightward, developing the Southern strategy that we covered earlier this season. As the Democratic Party passed civil rights legislation, it left white racists in the South without a party. Nixon saw what Goldwater and Wallace had done to court these people and planned to scoop them up for himself. That meant speaking their coded language, talking about law and order, coming out against integrated busing, but sending the kind of dog whistles that weren't missed by his constituency.
That's when he begins his campaign against the media, calls for banning busing, and a whole series of other efforts to take advantage of the Wallace vote and to make sure that he doesn't have a repeat of 1968.
We're covering Wallace for a number of reasons. One of the big ones is how he shifted the Republican Party further to the right, pushing Nixon to court the South, just as Goldwater had 4 years earlier. Wallace mirrored Goldwater in another interesting way. He, too, courted extremists like the John Birch Society. In fact, the founder of that organization, Robert Welch, fed the Wallace team names of extremists hungry to work on his campaign. Birchers loved the way he blamed everything on communists. And they controlled nearly a dozen states from Maine to California and could provide money, manpower, and votes, leaving Wallace to walk a similar tightrope to the one that Goldwater had, inviting nuts to support him without necessarily endorsing Birchers or the KKK.
He never really felt comfortable, I don't think, with these far-right figures. Remember, he was really started out as a Roosevelt, Truman progressive.
And these nutty people tested his boundaries, appearing in odd places throughout the 1968 campaign, like in the selection of Wallace's running mate. The campaign considered a former governor of Kentucky who had integrated schools. Or, and I'm not making this up, Colonel Sanders, the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken. Finally, they settled on Air Force General Curtis LeMay. He was that rare kind of candidate who made you think, maybe we should take a second look at that KFC guy. LeMay joined the campaign because he too detested the anti-war movement, which he thought was aiding the communists. He was the model for the Dr. Strangelove character Buck Turgidson, a military man with wild ideas about war. Trigger happy. The Wallace team tried to coach him to, cool it with the talk of using nuclear weapons. But in his first press conference of the campaign, he said this:
I have to say that we have a phobia about nuclear weapons. I think there might be times when it would be most efficient to use nuclear weapons. However, the public opinion in this country and through the world throw up their hands in horror when you mention nuclear weapons, just because of the propaganda that's been fed to them.
One of the reasons Barry Goldwater lost in 1964 was that people worried that he'd be loose with the nukes. Now, Wallace had made the same mistake. He raged against his staff for selecting LeMay, but actually, he'd been his strongest supporter. And Nixon delivered a solid blow by releasing ads in the South, warning them not to split the conservative vote. If they did, Hubert Humphrey would win, continuing Lyndon Johnson's legacy. In the end, Wallace captured just 14% of the votes in 1968. But his plan hadn't been to win the popular vote. Remember, this man could turn a loss into a win. His goal was not to wow the voters, but to win in the House of Representatives, like George W. Bush would in the year 2000. And he nearly pulled it off. The Humphrey-Nixon race was so close that if 1% of the vote from either New Jersey or Ohio had gone for Humphrey instead of Nixon, the election would have gone to the House of Representatives. And the House, at that time, was controlled by the South. It seems like Wallace was just an outsider with a small share of votes. Maybe you can understand how he posed a real threat to Richard Nixon. Nixon would have to work even harder if he was going to destroy the little judge. And he made several attempts. With Lurleen gone and no longer his puppet, Wallace once again needed the governorship. The race in 1970 was just ahead.
When Mrs. Wallace dies during office, the lieutenant governor, Brewer, takes over as governor. Well, he had had a kind of a rocky relationship with Wallace, and he decides to run for governor. And then Wallace and the Nixon people literally give him $300,000 in cash to try to defeat Wallace, because if Brewer can defeat Wallace, that means he's at an end politically, and they don't have to worry about him anymore.
The sitting president of the United States funded a governor's race in Alabama to get back at his political enemy. And true to form, Nixon's men nearly bungled the covert operation. Brewer's man went to New York City to get the first installment, where he met with one of Nixon's guys, who
hands him a briefcase filled with $100,000, the first installment, I think, of cash.
So far, so good. Like any spy thriller. Two guys meeting in a hotel, exchanging a briefcase stuffed with money. I imagine some swanky music, dim lighting, intrigue fit for the Pelican Brief. Governor Brewer's man thinks he's in the clear.
He gets ready to take the briefcase, and he said, "No, that's my briefcase."
Nixon's operative had brought too good a bag, something he couldn't just give away.
Wallace's man has to go behind the counter and get some large envelopes, stuffing $100,000 in $100 bills into it. And as he said, walking back to the hotel, hugging this $100,000 in $100 bills to his chest, he thought, what if I'm robbed here in the middle of New York City? That just goes to show, though, how desperate Nixon was to try to defeat him.
So it wasn't James Bond, but Nixon's money went to fighting Wallace in Alabama. And it didn't work. Once again, George Wallace won the highest office in his state. So the president tried again with a tool that he didn't originate, but that he perfected. He used his connections at the IRS to audit the Wallace campaign. George's brother Gerald insisted on keeping the checkbook, and immediately the staff accused him of stealing. Gerald was a political fixer. In the next 4 years of his brother's administration, he reported a 400% increase in his income, taking kickbacks on government contracts and quote-unquote consulting fees for work he never did. And he used to boast about this, unlike Al Capone, he paid 100% of the taxes on his boodle. Even the Justice Department investigated George Wallace, but the president never got anything on him. So in 1972, the investigations shut down. Once again, Nixon's team bungled their operation, but it wouldn't be their last move against George Wallace. As the 1960s turned into the 70s, writers and politicians keyed in on a change in American society, something that's easy to dismiss, but we really shouldn't. It was the way that white people came to feel alienated in that period. There were a few reasons for that. One was that the economy was slowing down. After World War II, Europe and parts of Asia were in rubble. The Soviet Union was more than a little backwards economically, and so we enjoyed a lot of prosperity because we were one of the few first world countries largely intact. By the 1970s, we were starting to see more competition, and our buying habits changed as most homes already had the fancy electronic appliances that they needed. Second, like today, there was a longing for a time that never existed. For them, it was the 1910s, an era of small farms. But that nostalgia ignores the reality that most working-class families in that era, and really the entirety of human history before that, lived on the edge of survival. As Dan points out in his book, one accident or illness could bankrupt a family, and there were no social safety nets. No workers' comp, no FDIC if the banks collapsed. Not to mention, farm work was grueling, especially before electricity. And still, people love nostalgia. Third, social changes like feminism, free love, civil rights, all those things we've already covered. Fourth, a growing wedge between those who thought that the United States had never done anything wrong and those who knew about the horrors and nonsensical missions of Vietnam, where scores of men died violently to take a mountain, only to abandon it almost immediately, allowing the enemy to retake it, and then we'd march back up it again. And of course, the slaughter of innocent civilians. This uneasiness in white communities came to be called the social issue, white Americans witnessing the breakdown of their quiet suburban union worlds, leaving, as one team figured it, between a fifth and a third of the electorate disillusioned and ready for a candidate like George Wallace. All of this and more mixed with underlying racism and fear of the other. Wallace gave people permission to express their ugliest thoughts more overtly.
I mean, I can remember I was dating this young woman in 1960 when I was in college, And I went to her home to pick her up, and the television was on. I think it was the Ed Sullivan Show, and Johnny Mathis was singing.
One of the best-selling performers of his generation, and an African-American.
And her father began yelling and walked over and slammed the on-off switch. And he said, "If I see another N-word on television, I'm going to throw up," he said. I mean, that's an extreme reaction. But I think it was a kind of, these people aren't in the shadows anymore. They're coming out.
Wallace, and increasingly Nixon, played to this demographic, the social issue, their fears, their feeling of decline, and their increasingly pointed racism. Wallace ran again in 1972, this time, once again, seeking the Democratic nomination. It was a new Wallace, one who'd been given a makeover by his new wife. She was a divorced woman, something that had derailed the Rockefeller campaign 8 years earlier, but now didn't seem to matter. Wallace claimed he was a moderate, that he no longer believed in segregation, though his language in private was just as foul as ever. Once again, he beat the drum against integrated school busing, which, of course, forced Nixon to try to outdo him. Nixon posed the idea of a constitutional amendment to prevent busing programs, something that was never going to happen, and deeply concerned his staff. Wallace, meanwhile, campaigned to the tune of "Gimme That Old Time Religion," the song used on repeat in the movie Inherit the Wind, about the Scopes monkey trial. He lectured about welfare fraud, railing about a woman getting 6 welfare checks, something that would soon be picked up by Ronald Reagan in describing his infamous welfare queen. He bellowed against elites, busing, and the federal government. But all of Wallace's plans were about to come crashing down. Arthur Bremer was a part-time janitor and busboy. His teachers remembered him as a, quote, pathetic loser. He laughed at strange times, causing classmates to think of him as weird. He volunteered on the Wallace campaign, hanging signs and distributing bumper stickers. He came home from volunteering one day, put up an NRA cardboard target on his kitchen door, and placed a Wallace button in the bullseye. Then he wrote in his diary,
"Now I start my diary of my personal plot to kill by pistol either Richard Nixon or George Wallace."
Bremer attended a number of rallies, but he couldn't get close enough to kill either target. Witnesses recall him doing target practice in a Milwaukee shooting range. He fired round after round from 70 feet away. Several bullets lodged in the ceiling, sending showers of plaster and dust raining down on the course. After more than 100 shots, he finally hit the target one time, but only in the outer ring. So he wrote,
"Still can't believe it. How does anybody hit with one of those things?"
He determined that he'd have to fire at close range. He attended more rallies, hoping to hit Nixon, who he deeply despised. He picked up inspiration from the character of Alec from the movie A Clockwork Orange. And Nixon was never close enough for Bremer to feel comfortable pulling the trigger. Finally, in May of 1972, in Laurel, Maryland, as Wallace shook hands with a crowd of supporters, Bremer shot him 5 times. Wallace was paralyzed from the waist down. Here's where Nixon took another paranoid, opportunistic swing. This was the same month as the first Watergate break-in, and a month before the famous one. Nixon had a concern. What if the assassin, Arthur Bremer, was one of his supporters? You can hear this on the Nixon tapes from the day of the shooting.
Bob, sir. Put a call in immediately to cross somebody that did something. First report.
It's hard to make that out, so I had actors recreate it from a transcript. This is Nixon talking to his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman.
Put a call in immediately to Clausen or somebody to the effect that the first reports of the interrogation, that a McGovern Kennedy person did this. Know what I mean? Rumors are going to flow all over the place. Put it on the left right away.
Before the investigation reached any conclusions, he wanted to blame the Democrats with no evidence. Put this thing on them. Then, according to the testimonies given by Charles Colson, Nixon's hatchet man, he said the following about Bremer's apartment. And I have not found a tape to corroborate this. I'm just going off of his testimony.
Wouldn't it be great? Oh, wouldn't it be great if they had left-wing propaganda in his apartment?
Then the president posited this idea. Maybe they could plant evidence in Bremer's apartment linking him to the McGovern campaign. Colson ordered E. Howard Hunt to ready himself to fly to Milwaukee, find a way into the apartment, and leave behind McGovern campaign materials. Sweet talk a janitor or a landlady. get access any way he could. Hunt's wife lectured him not to get involved, but he was anxious to curry favor with Colson and Nixon. Mercifully, the press had already beaten him to the apartment, gaining access and cataloging everything inside as the FBI and Secret Service battled over who had jurisdiction. Even if they managed to plant the evidence, it was too late, and the mission was canceled. That is how crazy Wallace made Nixon. He was willing to tamper with evidence and spread obvious lies to crush his opponents. Bremer volunteered for the Wallace campaign, not McGovern. Still, in the aftermath of an assassination attempt, the Nixon men spread rumors to help his re-election chances. Wallace mostly recovered after several surgeries, but the fighting judge was consigned to a wheelchair, and his chances at the presidency were greatly diminished.
For one thing, it destroyed him as a national political figure. Roosevelt in the 1930s could campaign from a wheelchair. You couldn't do that. Television cameras omnipresent. And although he ran for president in 1972, that was not really a likelihood as a Democratic candidate.
He failed a third time. During his race in 1968, he lost his wife. In 1972, the use of his legs. Television cameras could not resist the footage of him being carried or wheeled around. As a Rolling Stone writer described it,
2 heavy bodyguards carrying out the governor on what appeared to be a canvas lawn chair without legs, and depositing him in his wheelchair.
Which was followed up by an explanation of how Wallace managed to get into his car, and how
the little man in the wheelchair was smiling and waving like a kid on a merry-go-round.
The media couldn't get over his disability. Wallace tried to apply his usual touch of theater to the tragedy. He acquired a portable lectern that made it appear that he was standing on his own power during his speeches. Though he ran again for president in 1976, his chances at the Oval Office were over. The end of his career in the public eye can be a bit controversial. As his star faded, Wallace did the unexpected. He sought the forgiveness of prominent people in the Black community. In our interview, Dan argued that what really changed was not Wallace, but Alabama, as Black people started voting in greater numbers in the South.
Because you could put together a coalition, new Black voters, old-time white Democratic voters who hadn't made the switch yet and that's how Wallace changed. He suddenly began to appear and meet with Black voters, speak to Black audiences, and privately, there clearly was some guilt. My friend John Lewis told me about how he had met with him.
John Lewis being a major figure in the civil rights movement, including marching alongside Martin Luther King from Selma to Montgomery. He later became a member of Congress.
And Wallace, essentially, as John said, it was like I was a priest and he was asking for absolution. As he said, I really didn't hate anybody. And John, of course, knew what he had done. But John would forgive the devil if he asked him, I think. So he ended up, saying, of course, I'm glad you see things in a different way. But I think, yes, he had some guilt about it. But basically what changed was the politics.
Wallace's daughter wrote a book about how her father repented of his racism and turned to God, though some of his critics remained skeptical. Dignitaries came to meet him in his recovery, from Congresswoman and first Black female presidential candidate Shirley Chisholm to Elvis Presley, who was a Wallace supporter. Wallace also got religion. 2 years after the attack, Wallace appeared as a guest on Jerry Falwell's Old Time Gospel Hour on a hot August day. This was more than half a decade before the forming of the moral majority. Buses from hither and yon transported the faithful. Falwell hawked Bibles to finance his schools, which he said taught patriotism, discipline, and the love of mom and dad. Falwell introduced the governor like this.
For many years, we have loved and respected this man. For many years, we have prayed for the work, the career, and I might say the ministry of Governor George C. Wallace.
Wallace stood at his special podium and addressed the congregation and the audience at home.
I know that whatever your status economically or physically, if you have Jesus Christ in your heart and soul, then you are, by worldly standards, a multi-millionaire.
It's an uncomfortable mix knowing what we know about George Wallace. The Apostle Paul murdered Christians before becoming one himself and writing much of the New Testament. But it's hard to see this man's religion knowing his politics. prompting this line from a writer who was there.
As the church emptied, reporters, some of whom had flown in from Washington for the occasion, stood outside, a bit stunned by what they had seen. "It'll be scary as hell if these fanatics take control of the country," said one.
This was not Wallace's only tie to what would become the religious right. For his final presidential campaign, he hired Richard Viguerie to run his direct mailing. Viguerie being one of the founders of the New Right who would, in just a few short years, be part of the group that connected people like Falwell, Billy Graham, Pat Robertson, and Tim LaHaye to political figures. He also ran Anita Bryant's mail crusades against homosexuals. Wallace disrupted the Democratic coalition. He pushed Republicans further to the right. He made it more socially acceptable to be overtly racist. Stoked fears of integration, especially in schools. In the midst of these episodes about race, understand that the battles over segregation academies and tax exemptions and Bob Jones University all took place in the era of George Wallace. When you see the footage of the heroic march on Montgomery and watch people being beaten and sprayed with fire hoses, remember that they were demonstrating in George Wallace's Alabama. If you hear your brothers and sisters in Christ talk about states' rights and law and order, remember that was the language of George Wallace.
How could you get someone who is a hillbilly from, as he would describe himself, from South Alabama to when he was shot in Laurel Springs, Maryland? He had more Democratic delegate votes than anybody else at the time he was shot. He had won the state of Michigan the day after he was shot. I mean, this is a figure who rose to extraordinary national prominence. And basically what he understood, I think instinctively, was Kevin Phillips' advice to Richard Nixon after the close call in '68 was, you got to learn who people hate. And if you figure out who people are afraid of or they hate, then that's got to be your focus. And I think Wallace understood that.
Special thanks to Dan T. Carter. His book is The Politics of Rage. It had a lot of good stuff in it that I couldn't fit into this episode. Patrons of the show can hear more from my interview with him by giving a little each month to help with these stories. Visit trucepodcast.com/donate to help out. This show is basically a one-man operation, a ministry unlike any other out there. In an era where we're battling disinformation and AI-generated content, real voices from real people using real resources are becoming more and more important. Visit trucepodcast.com/donate for more information. You'll find a full list of sources on the website and in your show notes, including some of the Nixon tapes I listened to for this episode. Special thanks to everyone who gave me their voices for this episode, including Bob Stevenson, Josh Griffith, Chris Sloan, Dave Monroe, and Marcus Watson of the Spiritual Life and Leadership podcast. At the end of this long episode, I want to urge each and every one of us to search our hearts for racism and repent of that before God and the people we're accountable to. Christians are to be light and salt of the world, and we're to love our neighbors. We can't do the work of God with hatred or racism in our hearts. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Starin, and this is Truce.